And when any history of the migration of blacks from the South, it began in earnest after this speech. Because blacks suspected that something was going wrong. Now, white editorial writers made Booker T. Washington the leader of black America. They made him the leader of black America, declared that he was, and white philanthropy began to filter all the, not just for Tuskegee, the money that any black got for education had to come through Booker Washington. He was literally the dictator of black America. Now, I'm not so much against dictators if something good is being dictated, and sometime he dictated something good.
Jim Crow laws implemented in the late 19th and early 20th centuries following the Reconstruction era significantly undermined the progress made toward racial equality in the American South. These laws enforced racial segregation and disenfranchised African Americans through discriminatory practices in education, employment, voting, and public facilities. By institutionalizing a system of white supremacy, Jim Crow laws perpetuated racial prejudices and reinforced white racial power. These laws legitimized social and economic disparities, fostering an environment of systematic racism that marginalized African Americans and restricted their opportunities for advancement. The pervasive impact of these laws contributed to the enduring racial inequalities and tension that have had lasting effects on American society. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I'm Joseph Ward. Make sure you hit that like button. Today we're going further into hearing Dr. John Henry Clarke break down Booker T. Washington's 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech. But this week's video, we're concentrating on what was going on around throughout the African diaspora. What was happening throughout the African diaspora between 1895 and 1900. And we're talking about the implementation of Jim Crow laws, reinforcing white power, reinforcing inequality, reinforcing the dominance of the white society over the black labor class. Remember, the people that were brought over here to be the labor class, to be the underlings to the white society. So let me be quiet and let's continue listening to Dr. Clarke. We'll catch you on the other end.
All right. Booker Washington, this was his era. It is starting now. But what you have to do is to look at what happened not only in black America, but what happened in the totality of the African world in the years between the time he made that speech, 1895, in 1901. Those brief years, 1896, a light-skinned person who could pass for white and who'd been passing most of the time, got on a train and got in the white section, sit in the white section. But the conductor, who knew his family, wanted him to go to the black section. This is the Plessy versus Ferguson case. After this case, the Supreme Court said everything had to be separate so long as it was equal. It was never equal. And the intent was never to make it equal. Now, to show you the difference between the British and the United States, the British are oppressors with style. You're just as dead when no matter which one kills you now. Let's get that clear. They're both murderers. Only the British got style. Well, style won't bring you back alive if they kill you. All right. the British said that not only justice must be done, but it must appear to have been done. See, America won't even tell that lie. See, they don't even try to cover it up with words. They're blatant about it. They said it must be separate, but it has to be equal. And from then on, they began to make Jim Crow laws. The schools are not equal. Nothing is equal. The accommodation is not equal. In some places, there's no accommodation at all. There's some cities where there is no black theater. There is no black school of consequence. And when you've got a black school, many times those schools got the hand-me-down books from the white schools. I know that for sure because I went to one. So nothing was equal. Now, most of the Jim Crow laws were passed in that 5-year period between 1895 and 1900. There was a law in Mississippi saying that a black woman couldn't appear on any of the main streets unless she had an apron and a cap on, indicating she was a maid. And she couldn't go into any theater unless she was a nurse watching some white kid. So, because this custom spread to other states, many blacks who wanted to see a given movie at a white theater just put on a cap and put on an apron and grab some little white boy and say they're watching him winning the theater and integrated a generation ahead of integration. But that's neither here nor there. Now, 1896 again, let's look at Africa. 1896 in Africa, the British are trying to move into the hinterland of Ghana. All they've got is the coast. They've been there over 100 years, but all they've got to control is the coast. Then they move in, level penalties on the then king, Prempeh. Finally, the Akan people decide that they're not in a position to fight this war. Best to let the king go into exile and save the nation. So the king comes out to genuflex to the British and go into exile. And some British sergeant grabs the king by the neck of a king whose lineage goes back further than the oldest king lineage of Europe, over 1,000 years, and traceable, pushes the king's face down on the shoes of the British governor along with his mother. Purpose, humiliation. And he turns and says in his language, "O kinsman, is this necessary?" And the British exile him to a dungeon in Elmina Castle. Subsequently, they sent him to Seychelles Island in the Red Sea. But this is the period of the exiling of African kings who oppose colonialism. The king of Dahomey was exiled at the same time. Sekou Touré's grandfather, Samori, was exiled at the same time. Several of the Zulu kings were exiled at the same time. The politics of exile has become close to the end of the century. They became more aware of our possibility claiming freedom than we did. Now, the same year he made the speech, a young man from Great Barrington, Massachusetts, having finished fifth, was now at Harvard. 1 year after the speech, this young man was so brilliant, he wrote the first book in the Harvard series. And one of the first books published by Harvard, written by a student named W.E.B. Dubois. His book, The Suppression of the Slave Trade to the African Slave Trade to the United States, still worth reading. His statistics are good. And because we assume that the difference of opinion between W.E.B. Du Bois and Washington was a fight, we figured that we got to get on one side or the other. It wasn't a fight at all. It was a difference of opinion. And we can't have difference of opinion without converting them into fights. Du Bois from Great Barrington, Massachusetts, growing up in a predominantly white town, community, thought he'd go to Harvard because it was a socialist type of town. The town was incorporated, so everybody in the town owned the town. So 10 of the most brilliant young men from the town, high school, was automatically sent to Harvard at the expense of the town. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of them. They didn't send him to Harvard, they sent him to Fisk. But it was the finest thing that ever happened to him, because up until that point, he wasn't aware of black people as a people belonging to him. But when he got down in Tennessee and had to ride Jim Crow cars and eating Jim Crow restaurants, he saw the light of day, and he said that he would devote the rest of his life to race work. He thought racial prejudice was based on ignorance. It's based on the containment of power.
Let's look at a couple things that Dr. Clarke highlighted in this audio clip. So one of the first things that he was tackling, because it was basically him finishing up what we were covering last week, which was the 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech. So Dr. Clarke was basically saying that black people in America, especially black people in the South, responded to Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech by moving to the North, the great migration of black people to the North. That was them basically saying, from Dr. Clarke's point of view, that was the black people in the South basically saying, we don't really vibe with what you're saying. We don't agree with what you're saying. We think you are full of it. So we're going to show you that we're going to move north for better opportunities, because there are no opportunities available for us in the South. So like Dr. Clarke was explaining, some people brought into the speech and some people didn't buy into the speech. The people who didn't buy into the speech, they left, or they just didn't really believe or just rock with Booker T. Washington. But others showed through their actions how they felt about Booker T. Washington. Now, one of the things overall in this video is it's not about choosing sides. It's not about who was right and who was wrong. But we are breaking down everything that happened and trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together to see how we could use this information to move forward, to make our lives better. So Dr. Clarke also stated that the white media made Booker T. Washington the leader of black America. He was our chosen leader by white people. And through Washington's leadership, through Washington's appointment, all of the white philanthropy and all of the deeds that white people wanted to do for black people, and all of the funding and things that were coming for black people, had to come and be filtered through Booker T. Washington. So Booker T. Washington had the opportunity to use that to do good for black people, because he stated out he did do good things for black people. And remember, a lot of this is really boiling down to a difference in philosophy, a difference in agreement on how somebody should do things or how a group of people should do things. It's not necessarily right or wrong. It's, well, I see it this way and you see it this way. I believe we should do it this way and you believe we should do it that way. But we should be examining what can we learn from both sides that we can use to move forward, right? Dr. Clarke also wants us to take a look at the African diaspora between 1895 and 1900 or even 1901. Once again, what was actually going on throughout the African diaspora in 1895, between 1895 and 1901. So a couple of things that he pointed out that he wanted us to look at, but was the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case, which was a black person who could pass for white was caught sitting in a white section on the train, and that led to the separate but equal rulings, right? And he was also emphasizing that separate existed, but equal never existed, right? And any progress that was made toward equal was erased during that period, because now we're talking about Jim Crow. Now we're talking about white people reasserting their dominance over the black people, the people that they brought here to be their laborers, the people that they brought here to be their underlings. Check the psychology behind that. So basically, through the Jim Crow laws, it was reinforced that injustice is the American way. White power is the American way. You people can fight for all of the social and political gains that you want, but white power is the way. White power is what America was founded upon. And if you don't believe that, then you need to check your history books, and you in the wrong country. So he also pointed out in America that a black woman, it was interesting that a black woman couldn't be on the street unless she was wearing, in specific places, especially in these Jim Crow places, but black women could not be on the street unless she was wearing the garments or the clothing of domestic workers or nurses or maids. And they had to be escorting white children, because they had to be, if you were going to be seen in public, you had to know your place in public and still resemble the clothes or wear the garments of the women and the people, the women who represent the class of people who are the lowest rung. But if you're not wearing that, you can't even be seen in public. But if you are going to be seen in public, you got to be seen in public in the garments that represent you being the lowest rung of society. He also pointed out in 1896, the same year, well, 1 year after the speech, that the British basically made them move into the interior of Ghana, taking over Ghana, taking over the Ashantis, taking over everything over there, and exiling their king, disrespecting their king, grabbing the king by the back of his shirt, pushing the king down, pushing the king's face into the boot of the Englishmen, of the British soldiers, disrespecting the king, them reinforcing their dominance, white dominance being reinforced. You get what I'm saying? White dominance being reinforced during this time period. Between 1895 and 1900, white dominance was reinforced throughout the African diaspora. Also, a number of African kings were exiled. And when those African kings were exiled, their kingdoms were left vulnerable to the Europeans. And we know the Europeans colonized them. He also talks about the rise of W.E.B. Du Bois during this time as well. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the first students to write books for Harvard, as Dr. Clarke was stating. Of course, the first black, but one of the first students. W.E.B. Du Bois also during this time, or before going to Harvard, W.E.B. Du Bois had to go to Fisk University. And during this time going to Fisk University, he was more exposed to an authentic black experience. And being exposed to this authentic black experience, he learned that black people were unjustly discriminated against, unjustly stepped on, unjustly brutalized and terrorized by white people. So therefore, stoking a fire within him to do something about it and push back and have a voice, be an advocate, be an activist for black people. And that was a part of what W.E.B. Du Bois did that's part of what he did upon his journey, right? But that also leads me back to the opinions of W.E.B. Du Bois versus the opinions of Booker T. Washington. There were those who were staunch Du Bois fans and those who were staunch Washington fans. I am saying let's examine both closely and see what we can use from both, rather than looking at one being more superior, one's philosophy being more superior than the other. Because look at our overall conditions of where we are now, going into choosing sides and fight mode. And I don't like you because you're on this side, and I don't like you because you're on this side. Because we take that mentality into every other realm that we exist in. Think about it. Dr. Clarke is helping us realize that we got to get past the petty differences, the things that pit us against each other. We have to get past them, get over them, and look at the bigger picture and see how we can get this thing back on track for ourselves. Hey, so that's the video for today. Happy Tuesday. I'm Joseph Ward. Once again, make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you comment, subscribe, share, and let's deeply, deeply, deeply think about what Dr. Clarke is telling us. What did you learn from W.E.B. Du Bois? And what did you learn from Booker T. Washington? I want you in the comments telling me what you learned from Dr. Clarke, what you learned from W.E.B. Du Bois, and what you learned from Booker T. Washington. I want to know. I want to know. I want to know. I love you all. Make sure y'all catch that next video coming up.